Hello, this is Craig Brailsford with RedChip Companies. Thank you for joining today's event with 60 Degrees Pharmaceuticals, which trades on the Nasdaq under the ticker SXTP. With us today, we have Jeffrey Dow, Chief Executive, President, and Director of 60 Degrees Pharmaceuticals. We will begin with a brief presentation in a moment, and then we'll open this event to your questions. I will keep everyone's lines muted throughout the presentation. Users may ask a question at any time by using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom window. Before we begin, please allow me to read the safe harbor statement. This call may contain forward-looking statements within the meaning of the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. All statements pertaining to future financial and/or operating results, along with other statements about the future expectations, beliefs, goals, plans, or prospects expressed by management, constitute forward-looking statements. Any statements that are not historical fact should also be considered forward-looking statements. Of course, forward-looking statements involve risks and uncertainties. I now turn this webinar over to Jeff. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeff Dow. Craig, thank you very much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. This is just a continuation of appropriate disclaimers for your information. So at 60 Degrees, our mission is to develop new small molecule therapeutics to treat and prevent infectious disease. We have proven expertise because we've already taken a product through the FDA and secured FDA approval and put it on the US market. And that product, which is depicted in the top right hand of the screen, is Arakoda. That product is protected by 3 Orange Book US patents. And we have 40 plus other patents either filed or pending for Arakoda and various other products for various diseases. At the moment, our R&D focus is on advancing a pipeline of products for tick-borne disease, specifically around Babesiosis. And we have a growing commercial revenues through the presence of Arakoda in the market for malaria prevention. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later in the presentation. We're a very small team, but we're all very experienced and very focused. I have an R&D background and was the project leader that took Arakoda to the FDA and got it approved. I've been working with Brian Smith, our Chief Medical Officer, for many years. He's been through the FDA process twice. Kristen Landon, our Chief Commercial Officer, has been involved with 10 product launches, and Tyron Miller, our CFO, has been there with us through it all. Just a brief introduction to our products. Arakoda, the generic name is Tafenoquine, was approved by the US FDA in August 2018 and was commercially available starting at the end of 2019. It has never been formally launched as a pharmaceutical product because the timing of its introduction coincided with COVID and a severe curtailment of travel, which is the target market. It's differentiated from its generic competitors by a number of things, including the ability to target all of the parasite life cycle stages, no known drug resistance, and a conveniently weekly dosing format where the existing products are weekly dosed. And no other antimalarial on the market has all of these features. It has an established safety profile with 8 published studies with the approved regimen in more than 1,100 patients, an overall adverse event rate that's comparable to placebo with continuous dosing for up to a year's exposure. It does require an enzyme screen prior to use, which is similar or analogous to a cholesterol test. And then we've published extensively, and if you have interest, I'd encourage you to review those publications. Malaria, of course, is prevalent in tropical countries, and most Americans lack immunity to the disease. And that's why CDC recommends that you take malaria prophylaxis if you're traveling to Africa for a safari or you're going somewhere else for business. The rates of malaria in returning travelers continue to increase, and almost all of these are in folks who didn't take their malaria chemoprophylaxis. And that's the main reason why CDC recommends it, is it is a life-threatening disease if you contract it. On the left-hand side of this figure displays the complicated life cycle of malaria through both the mosquito, then into the liver, and then into the bloodstream, where the continuous replication and bursting of red blood cells causes the symptoms of malaria. What's sort of trademark and important about Tafenoquine is that it kills all of those life cycle stages everywhere. And that means that in places where you have different types of malaria with different dormancy periods, you don't have to worry about it. It covers everything and there's no drug resistance. And of course, it's also unique with that weekly dosing profile after you take a loading dose prior to travel. We haven't done too much commercially with the malaria indication yet. That's about to change, as I'll share in a minute. But we've seen pretty good year-on-year sales growth of the product over the last year or so. In 2024, we did an extensive market research program and outreach to various physicians and groups to figure out what we needed to do for a commercial pilot program. And probably the overarching feedback was a real lack of awareness of the product. And of course, that's something that's overcomeable with education and differentiation campaigns. And so in just a couple of weeks ago, we began the initiation of a commercial pilot and the hiring of 2 inside sales reps to begin discussions with physicians to educate them about the product. We hope to do that and to drive prescribing preferences towards Arakoda by educating physicians about the unique features and benefits of Arakoda. And then, of course, because our product remains on patent and the competitors are mainly generic in nature, there's an access and affordability piece we need to address as part of the commercial pilot as well. So that's all going to unfold over the next 6 months or so. What we have come to learn in interacting in the marketplace with physicians and patients is that babesiosis, which is a tick-borne disease transmitted by the same ticks that transmit Lyme disease, has become one of the things that physicians prescribe the product for. And this, combined with some pretty compelling scientific literature, some of which I'll share in a minute, have led us to go back and design a clinical trial program around babesiosis to try and provide data and evidence for what we've seen in the scientific literature on a case-by-case basis and in our indirect interactions with other folks in the marketplace. So we know from dogma that babesiosis comes in an acute disease form, and it's a parasite a lot like malaria, so it ruptures the red blood cells and causes flu-like symptoms and anemia, which in some people can get worse in severity and result in hospitalization. If you're hospitalized for Babesia, the mortality rate can be as high as 2%, more so in patients with certain comorbidities. If you have high risks, such as cancer, or you're taking B-cell depleting antibodies, or you don't have a spleen, babesiosis can persist for many years, relapse in some cases, and that's a unique patient population where the existing standard of care doesn't work very well. There are probably 40,000 cases a year, and the prevalence is increasing. And importantly, this acute phase of disease is very easily diagnosed through microscopy or parasite-specific molecular tests called PCRs. Chronic disease is less well recognized, and you could think of it conceptually as a co-infection with Lyme disease because the ticks transmit the same organisms. And so in many patients with post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, laboratory evidence in some cases will show either exposure to Babesia or an active Babesia infection. those folks typically present with chronic fatigue and one or two other symptoms of the disease. And so physicians prescribe based on clinical presentation, given that there are very few other treatment options, or the patients have often tried many things previously. Because there's not a whole lot of lab confirmation and there isn't a lot of scientific literature, one of the things we've been doing at 60 Degrees is to try very hard to quantify the size of that market through three approaches: monitoring the real-world prescribing of Arakoda. We sponsored a DNA sequencing study in chronic fatigue patients at North Carolina State University, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. And we're conducting an extensive quantitative market research program for the US market, the results of which will be available soon. This is the typical course of disease in a relapsing immunosuppressed patient. And what the graph is showing is the percentage of red blood cells that are infected with Babesia. And then the various treatments this patient experienced are indicated with the colored bars at the bottom. So you can see for the first 9 months of treatment, this patient was dosed with everything standard of care related to Tafenoquine, azithromycin, clindamycin, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't until Tafenoquine was added in addition to standard of care that this patient was cured. And these data were published by a Yale physician last year. And in a series of 5 patients like this, Tafenoquine had an 80% cure rate. That case study I showed you is a pretty good reflection of probably half a dozen papers in the scientific literature showing that Tafenoquine is active against Babesia parasites in animal models. So we feel very confident that the drug will work. And now what we've been doing over the last year or so is putting together a pretty tailored and focused clinical development plan to produce evidence and data that will support an eventual change in labeling. So we had an advice meeting with the FDA in January of 2024. And in 2024, we also set up 2 clinical trials. One's a randomized placebo-controlled study in hospitalized patients. The second is an expanded access study in immunosuppressed patients. And that study is open label. We funded a prevalence study at North Carolina State University, which is finished. The data are being prepared for publication. And there was a sufficient frequency of positive Babesia PCRs in that sample of chronic fatigue patients that we felt continuing the feasibility assessment to do a study in chronic disease was warranted. Then that's where we are with that third phase 2 open label study that's listed here. What we hope to do is get multiple data outputs in the first quarter of 2026, and that'll lead to an opportunity to make a decision in Q2 of 2026 about what our regulatory strategy is going to be with multiple inputs of data from hopefully 3 different clinical trials. This is our portfolio as it stands at the moment. We covered the commercial pilot program for malaria and our clinical trial program for human babesiosis. We're also doing a pilot study for some veterinary indications for Arakoda for tick-borne disease, specifically in canine babesiosis, and one other program we haven't made public. And then we have pilot studies with an IV formulation of Tafenoquine for treatment of Candida and an antiviral that we're evaluating against a number of viral diseases. In terms of the total accessible market, for Arakoda, we have patent life through the end of 2035. And I mentioned we have 3 Orange Book patents protecting the malaria indication. We think, given the positioning in the market, that there may be up to 1.7 million prescribing opportunities during that 10-year period. We think with chronic babesiosis, based on existing early adopter prescriber patterns, there may be a treatment pool of 350,000 patients for that particular market segment. And we're in the process of doing a more extensive market research survey to see if the actual pool might be larger than that. And the markets for acute babesiosis are smaller in scope. We're in a good financial position. We had 1.7 million in cash at the start of the year and have raised 2 million more in at the market financing since then. That led us to report a cash runway through August of this year. We have relatively low debt and a total shareholders' equity that exceeds the Nasdaq required minimum. As I mentioned, we had some recent financings. We're employing those funds to do the malaria commercial pilot, the babesiosis market research assessments, the continuation of our 2 trials that are up and running in the moment, and then prep work for the chronic babesiosis study, which we hope to get up and running later in the year, funding pending. So over the next year, we've got some exciting milestones coming up. Of course, we just reported on Thursday 140% year-on-year revenue growth increase, which we're very proud of. We hope to report the market research and epidemiologic outputs for our babesiosis market research studies at the end of Q2. There'll be sales outputs coming out of our Arakoda commercial pilot beginning in Q3. Some updates on the recruitment status of our Babesia trials in Q4. We hope to do the first data outputs from the Babesia studies in Q1, and then that'll set up the regulatory discussion and casting that strategy and pathway going forward to getting new labeling. So that's it. I'd be delighted to take some questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jeff. To reach Jeff, you can use the raise hand button. I'll then call on you and you can unmute your line, or you can type in your question in the Q&A text box. Jeff, we already have some questions here before us. With Arakoda's off-label traction accelerating in the Lyme and babesiosis communities, what are the implications for broader physician adoption trends, and how might this early momentum inform your market expansion strategy?
So with acute disease, there's a clear unmet medical need. And now I'm expressing my opinion, not an opinion of the company or anybody else. I think for physicians who are treating immunosuppressed patients and are familiar with the literature, the data for Tafenoquine are pretty compelling already. And so the way we're approaching that is to do a small repeat clinical study to confirm those early observations. And our hope is that will lead to a label change. And then, of course, the early adopters in the chronic babesiosis community, that's a signal that there's something there that we didn't know about before. And so we are slowly exploring a feasibility study for doing an open label study in chronic babesiosis. And that will enable us to be a lot more informed in how we talk about that opportunity.
Thank you, Jeff. As your malaria pilot program launches, what leading indicators are you most focused on to validate Arakoda's unique clinical and logistical advantages in endemic settings, particularly in comparison to legacy prophylactics?
So I think the ultimate goal there is there are a whole bunch of physicians that prescribe generic legacy medications for malaria prophylaxis. Speaking from a company perspective, we think Arakoda's has many features and benefits that are better than those existing options. And so the ultimate proof of principle is there a change in prescribing habits from those medications to Arakoda for physicians who've never prescribed Arakoda before? So prescribing habits is how we'll be tracking the success of that commercial program.
The inclusion of institutions such as Yale and Brigham Young in your phase 2/3 Babesiosis trial seems to reflect strong academic buy-in. How does this level of institutional engagement shape your confidence in downstream adoption and eventual clinical guidelining?
So, Craig, I think that many of the academic experts who've graciously agreed to be principal investigators on our hospital study, many of them are leaders in the research field of babesiosis and have strong links to the folks who write the guidelines for babesiosis. And indeed, some of them have even written them in the past. So our anticipation is if we're successful in confirming previous findings in the literature and securing label changes, then the guideline changes or updates will likely happen pretty shortly thereafter.
This person is from Yale, he says, and he writes, about 41% of babesiosis patients were co-infected with Lyme disease, making it the most common co-infection. This aligns with the overlapping geographic distribution in the Northeast and Upper Midwest. How is 60 Degrees Pharmaceuticals evaluating Arakoda's performance in these complex co-infection scenarios?
So from our perspective, Arakoda is a drug that's already commercially available, and prescribers are free to make whatever decisions are best for their patients. Whether they have babesiosis as a mono infection or some sort of co-infection. And because that's the reality on the ground, we've structured all our clinical trials so that we don't exclude people with co-infections. And so the approach is going to be, when those trials are over, we'll see what the data suggest are important covariates in terms of the clinical responses to drugs and or any other aspects of the biology that haven't been reported out before.
Given the promising 80% response rate in the expanded access setting, what opportunities do you see to accelerate Arakoda's positioning in chronic or relapsing babesiosis, particularly in high-risk populations underserved by current standards of care?
So as it relates to folks with a objective status of immunosuppression, the consequences of contracting babesiosis are pretty dire. It's a persistent, technically you might make an argument it's relapsing, but the original infection never goes away. So persistent is an appropriate word to describe it. So what we're hopeful is that if our expanded access study reports out an 80% cure rate like the earlier one did, the case for a label change will be very compelling. And for those particular group of patients, Arakoda has the potential to be a life-changing medication. For folks who have what we call chronic disease, which it is not necessarily, it overlaps with the immunosuppressed population in that the assumption is that there is a continuing active infection, but it can be broader than just an immunosuppressed status. That's a more poorly understood clinical manifestation of the infection. And we're approaching that from a perspective of learning and trying to do appropriate trials to investigate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. You've managed to significantly scale R&D activity with lean capital deployment. What internal benchmarks or efficiencies have enabled this progress, and how might this translate into sustainable long-term development velocity?
So we've intentionally targeted programs that build on existing data, supply chain presence, or knowledge, so that the pathway to the next indication or milestone is short and relatively risk-free, or as risk-free as you can do for a biotech company. So when we licensed Arakoda from the Army, it had already been through 20 clinical trials. It was supported with significant in-kind funding from the government, and with the gap or the gaps we had to fill to get to FDA were very definable. And then with Babesiosis, we're obviously building on the existing commercial infrastructure. We intentionally chose a dose to go into clinical trials that mostly reflected the safety profile that's already been proven and FDA bought into, so that when it came to a labeling discussion down the road, it's all very low risk. And low risk also means shorter timelines and lower cost.
Arakoda's real-world usage is yielding compelling anecdotal efficacy. How are you
Yeah.
leveraging? Yep. How are you leveraging this emerging data to enhance your regulatory dialogue and future trial endpoints, especially in areas with no approved therapy?
So if you think about immunosuppressed patients, FDA are very aware that there are no FDA-approved treatments that are curative for persistent babesiosis in immunosuppressed patients. We think they can see the same thing that we can from the literature. And there's been a dialogue back and forth on that study and the hospital study since January of last year, where we understand, or we think we understand, what they want us to do. So from that perspective, that's tying the compelling unmet medical need to specific trials that we're undertaking to try and solve that problem. And then with respect to the chronic babesiosis indication, patients tell us they're hurting and they don't have options. And even though that disease is not very well described in the literature, we've treated that as a signal that something's wrong and something's missing. And so we're trying to stand up a trial that's responsive to the unmet medical need that those patients have brought to our attention.
With an interim analysis on the horizon for the Babesiosis trial, what steps are you taking to ensure operational readiness, and how do you weigh the strategic value of a strong interim readout in shaping future partnering or funding discussions?
So either of the two studies we have up and running already should show us or confirm that Arakoda kills Babesia parasites and results in clinical benefit. It won't take many patients to prove that with the expanded access study. The reason to run the interim analysis on the randomized hospital study is because no one's ever done one before, and so we don't know how many patients we need to get to that statistically significant outcome. But either of those shots on goal should get us to the point where we know we've confirmed what the literature suggests. And then it's a question of how big the market actually is for chronic babesiosis, as to whether partnering, profit sharing, or further funding makes sense. If it's a market as large as the chronic fatigue syndrome market, then dedicated larger trials may be needed, and partnering and seeking funding along with that makes sense. If it's going to be a tight label focused on immunosuppressed patients, then we're really talking about an expansion of the existing Arakoda label. And we're already doing a pretty good job of fielding that product and generating the revenue from it. And so it would be more of a 60p focused commercial enterprise for that narrower label. So somewhere between those two spectrums is where we could end up.
Your revenue concentration remains US centric, yet your European and Australian distribution footprints are active. What are the next steps in scaling international exposure, and how do you view Arakoda's global commercial potential over the next 12 to 24 months?
So I think with European sales, it's mostly going to be on a pre-market basis for tick-borne disease indications. And so that trend may follow but lag behind what we've seen with the US market. On the Australian side, it's mostly for malaria prevention because officially there's no Lyme disease or chronic tick-borne disease in the same way that we think about it in the US. And so the market there is mainly focused on malaria prevention. And I say what I just said about Australia with a big asterisk because it's like with any of these tick-borne or lung syndromes, there's a lot we don't know about them, and you don't find stuff out until you go ask the question.
Jeff, I'm not seeing any more questions in the queue. Do you have a final value proposition that you'd like to express before I say a few words about how to get in touch with us?
Yeah, I mean, we're the smallest Nasdaq listed drug company with an FDA approved product. And that right there encapsulates both the opportunity and the risk. It's very likely we're going to be successful doing it again. It's very likely that we're going to increase our sales. And times have been tough for biotech companies, as everybody on the call knows.
Thank you very much, Jeff. For a replay of this webinar, go to redchip.com/events. Scroll down to the event archive. For more information on 60 Degrees Pharmaceuticals, reach us at 1-800-REDCHIP or email us at sxtp@redchip.com. Please visit the information page created by RedChip for 60 Degrees Pharmaceuticals. It's sxtpinfo.com. There you can view and download the investor presentation and fact sheet and sign up for news alerts. Thanks again to our participants today, and thank you very much, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Craig, and I appreciate everyone dialing in. It's been a real pleasure to talk to everyone today. Thank you.